Welcome to the lecture number 8. This is Dripta and the topic for today's lecture is competence and performance, Lang and Parole. Some of you are familiar with these concepts and for some of you these concepts are new. So, today we will be talking about the idea of competence and performance and also clarify certain questions related to knowledge of language. We will also introduce certain concepts which are introduced by Saussure, Saussurian concepts of language knowledge and usage, and we will also talk about the usage of our knowledge of the knowledge and usage of language. So, we have a few questions in the initial part. Some of the questions you have already come across in the previous lectures. So, how do we investigate our grammatical capacities? If we ask this question, you can understand that this is a very basic question for our discipline, and also if you ask the question how do we investigate the grammatical black box, you can understand the background, right, why we are asking these questions. So, investigating our grammatical capacities and also investigating the grammatical black box, these are the basic questions of linguistics that we deal with, and we have been talking about them in different ways. So, please try to think about the fact that there is a difference between what people know and what people do. So, when I am saying what people do, of course, I am talking about how people use them, right, how people use language. So, if you think about ordinary conversations, so you can say that the conversations are reflections of our linguistic capacities. So, we have been talking about our linguistic capacities for some classes. I mean, we previously talked about it, and we are also now trying to relate to the capacity of language with the usage of language when we use them. So, there is a distinction between what comes out from our mouth and what is the underlying system. So, when I am saying underlying system, of course, I am indicating the knowledge of language question that we have been addressing several times, because that is a central question of our discipline. So, now I will ask you to think about the ways of investigating the underlying system, and some of you already know that we adopt methods of the natural science to when we try to understand the underlying system. So, we observe and also record the behavior of the speakers. So, when we are saying behavior of the speakers, we are basically talking about the speech. We observe and record the speech of different speakers in different situations, and then we analyze them. That's our job as linguists. We also construct theories from the data. So, for us data is the usage, data is the recorded data that we the recorded version of the speech that we obtain from the speakers, and we try to analyze them and construct theories from the data. And our aim is, of course, to understand the nature of language. So, we already talked about the idea string of words, if you remember from some previous lectures. So, we have to understand that certain string of words are not a part of our language. So, these are basically ungrammatical. If you remember the idea of ungrammaticality, we can figure out what is ungrammatical, that is a part of our capacity of language. We can also talk about the judgments. We can give judgments and we have certain intuitions. So, intuitive judgments or reactions, they help us to understand the black box we have been talking about. So, at this point I will ask you to pause and think about the first two questions. What is a non-sentence and what is a sentence? You can tell me that oh, this is directly related to the idea of ungrammaticality, but when I am asking you to think about a non-sentence, You can also think about the string of words, combinations, and ungrammaticality as well. So, what is a sentence? You are definitely talking about some specific orders, and we talked about rules in the previous class. So, you understood what do we mean by rules in terms of combinations, you already learnt about it. So, our knowledge of language helps us to differentiate between a non-sentence and sentence. So, this is something which is very important for you to understand. The knowledge is actually helping us to quickly give the intuitive judgment about a non-sentence and sentence. So, now we will come to the definition of competence, which is a new term for today's class. So, competence refers to what we know about language. So, it is actually the knowledge of language. Now, we have a specific term for the knowledge of language, and this is the knowledge is unconscious. We already talked about it previously. So, our unconscious knowledge of different structures, for example, sounds, words, rules of combining them together, this is important. And we combine different linguistic elements to form permissible sentences in any language. And also we will come to the definition of the next term for today's class, performance. Performance is basically the use of language. How we use the knowledge of language is very, very important. So, we use in actual speech, and we can also comprehend when someone else is using them. But you have to keep in mind that language usage includes stammering, pause, slip of tongue, etc. These are part of our language usage. So, these are part of performance. When we are discussing the idea of performance, you have to keep in mind that these are part of performance. So, Chomsky talked about this dichotomy in his second book, which is the aspects of the theory of syntax, and in another book called Knowledge of Language, he talked about the same idea in a slightly different way. So, he differentiated between I language or internalized language and E language, externalized language. So, some of you are already familiar with these terms. So, there is a slight difference, but these are somehow related to knowledge and usage. Now, we will come to the definition of langue and parole, which is a similar dichotomy, but not identical. So, there are certain conceptual ideas which are differentiating the definitions of langue and parole from the ideas of competence and performance. So, you are already familiar with the name of Ferdinand de Saussure, because you learnt about him from the class where you learnt about the features of language. So, Saussure talked about langue and parole in 1915, and you know about signified and signified, and now you are learning about another dichotomy given by Saussure, which is langue and parole. So, langue is the social reality constraining each speaker. Here we are talking about the knowledge of language, which is a collective knowledge of language. So, this is different from the Chomskyan notion. Chomsky does not talk about this collective notion of the knowledge of language, but Saussure is talking about it. And you also have to remember that the work was done in 1915, and so this is much before Chomsky, but the focus is also different, that you should know. Parole is a combination of signs in the mind of a speaker. This definition is also important, because you are talking about the usage in a different way. So, and this is not collective, this is individual. So, we are talking about the psychophysical mechanisms by which they are externalized. Let us come back to the Chomskyan distinctions. Here you can think about an analogy of turning off a light. So, if you turn off light, it can it might stop our reading, the performance, but it won't affect our knowledge of language, right. I mean, if there is no light, you can't read, but it doesn't say that you don't have the capability of reading, right. So, this is an analogy that Chomsky himself has given, and it is important for us to understand this. And if you want to talk about the slip of tongues, so there is some sort of recognition that you are making a mistake. You yourself can clarify that there is a mistake, and thus there is a mismatch between competence and performance. There is a mismatch between what you know and what you say. When you are saying it, you know that this is not something which I know, but there is a deviation. And these mistakes are a part of all of us. It is not that all of us speak something when there is no deviation, there is no slip of tongue. I mean, it is a part of our speech. And you can say that these are results of carelessness, or maybe you are tired, so these things are happening, but this is very much a part of our performance. So, if I ask you to think about speech impairment now, you can think about the areas of pathology, like if there is a stroke and partial loss of language after the stroke, how will you talk about the partial loss of language in terms of usage and knowledge. So, you can say that this is impossible to understand that there are mistakes if there is a brain damage, and as a result it is affecting the person's grammar. So, you know that some of you know that there is a direct relationship between the brain damage and loss of speech, because there is a relationship between brain and language. We already mentioned that briefly. So, if patients are having a full recovery again, and they can gain back their ability to use the language. So, you have to keep in mind that when the patient recovers, the patient speaks the same language. They do not speak a different language, they do not acquire a new language in a different way, but it is the same language that they are gaining back. So, it is basically an evidence. It is an evidence which is indicating the knowledge of language, right. So, the knowledge of language is all time intact, though there is some kind of temporary some difficulties to talk about it, at temporary abilities to explain it. So, you have to get some ideas from the cases of speech impairment, that if there is some brain stroke and loss of language and the patient is gaining back language, temporarily the patient will not be able to identify the mistakes that he is making, but later he or she will be gaining back the capacity. So, we have been talking about generative linguistics, and it is all about competence. So, if you are familiar with this term generative linguistics, which is related to generative grammar, I already talked about the idea of generative grammar briefly. So, in generative linguistics we talk about competence. All the time we are talking about the knowledge of language, right, and performance is a crucial evidence of competence. So, you know that we have a knowledge of language, we are theoretically gaining the data after different experiments and analysis, but some evidences will help us to create theories, but this performance is a crucial evidence for understanding the knowledge of language. That is something that we have to remember, and this is how knowledge of language and usage of language are always interrelated. Whenever you are talking about knowledge of language, you just cannot ignore the usage, because based on the usage you are constructing the theories of the knowledge of language. So, now coming back to the idea of Lange and Parole again, let us talk about a few more issues. So, how is the system of language in Saussurean dichotomies? I already told you that there are differences, right. So, it is not identical. The distinction between competence and performance is not identical with the distinction between Lange and Parole. So, you can basically talk about a number of factors. If you are familiar with the ideas of etymology or philology, you know that this is both the areas are historicist in nature, and they use concrete products of language system. They do not talk about abstract ideas mostly. So, in Saussurean dichotomy, it is very important for us to note, specifically if you are coming from a social science background, you already know about the importance of Saussure's work. Saussure talked about the abstract ideas, which is very important. It's a jump, it's a theoretical jump. So, Saussure talked about abstract ideas and also talked about the idea of linguistic knowledge as a collective knowledge. Along with that, Saussure emphasized that language is a social fact. So, these three things are important for you to remember, and if you start doing things with linguistics, you have to come back to these again and again, that you know, this is abstract, it is collective, knowledge is collective, and language is a social fact. So, all 3 points are super important for us. Chomsky focused on generative capacity and talked about idealized abstract knowledge of language in the literature for discussing competence. But now here we have to, we are talking about post-Saussurean development, keeping in mind Chomsky's theoretical ideas, that social variation is actually integrated in the study of the knowledge of language later. So, this is important for us to mark, because here I am saying that the knowledge of language, the knowledge of language is not, the idea is given by Chomsky, and Chomsky is not considering the idea that language is a social fact that Saussure did. But now people have started looking at the idea of knowledge of language while talking about social variation or language variation, keeping in mind the social factors. So, variation studies is a big domain in linguistics, which is trying to integrate competence and performance, and it is talking about some kind of orderly heterogeneity. So, I have put this in quote because I have borrowed this term from Weinrich, Lebov and Herzog, which is a very important piece of work for sociolinguists like me, and we talk about this orderly heterogeneity from different viewpoints. So, we have been talking about the post-Saussurean synthesis, and we have to talk about it, and we have to think about it. So, when we try to talk about the knowledge of language and usage of language, how do we talk about it? What are the different areas, or what are the different helps that we take? So, we do conduct psychological experiment, not all of us, but some of us conduct experiments to understand the nature of the knowledge of language and at times usage. We also take help of brain scans, if we can try to understand the physiological difficulties and the usage, the relationship between these two. And you already know that we pay a lot of attention towards the native speakers' judgments, and that is why you already did some work on grammaticality, and I asked you to think about the well-formedness and ill-formedness, if you remember. So, if you think about the logical problem of language acquisition, it is of course related to the knowledge of language. There is a transition in children's language acquisition. So, initially you can say that there is no knowledge of language, and I mean there is some kind of inherited language knowledge that we will be discussing in the next class. But now it is important for us to understand that when children are not speaking at all, no knowledge of language to speak and understand, and then they basically show a transition where they like speak and understand like adults. So, this transition is important, and we also do lot of research on the developments of language in children in order to understand the knowledge of language and usage. Now there are very sophisticated tests from different fields to work on the grammatical judgments, and at times there are computer assisted experiments as well. So, and they ask different questions related to knowledge of language. So, we try to come back to the basic question, if you remember the Plato's problem, through different ways. It is also very important for us to understand that the understanding of knowledge of language and usage, both from Chomskyan and Sassurian point of view, it can be used in several other domains. So, I have taken an example of the domain of language teaching, which can be easily understood by you, and some of you are also coming from a background where you are interested in linguistics because you are either teaching or working on education. So, this will be useful for you. So, you if you have some knowledge of some understanding of the knowledge and usage of language, you can understand the language proficiency of the learner. So, proficiency is very important for the researchers in the domain of language teaching. So, knowledge of language and the related questions can help you to comment on the proficiency. And you also try to you can basically differentiate between the role of content knowledge and contextual knowledge. So, how performance is playing a role here, and the teacher's identity and evaluate the language acquisition. So, how the teacher is evaluating the learner, how you are evaluating the teacher if you are a teacher educator, and whether the teacher is a non-native speaker or not is another important question, because you can comment on the nature of language acquisition. If the teacher is a non-native speaker, then the pattern will be different, or we are assuming that there will be differences. The grammaticality judgments can have a different pattern if the teacher is a non-native speaker of a particular language. We also learn a lot about teacher's talk and relation to the lessons, how the teacher talk about the lesson and how the teacher talk in the class. So, all these things are related to the knowledge of language as well. Some more points which are important. So, we do get a lot of insights about the community based language learning if we pay attention to social factors related to knowledge of language, keeping the Sassurian or post Sassurian developments of the knowledge of language research. We talk about collaborative learning and individual learning separately and the relationship between these two. So, this is another field which can get some benefit. We analyze the lesson content. If you know the acquisition pattern and the knowledge of language related ideas of the target learners, then the lesson content can be analyzed from based on the ideas. And finally, the teacher development, how the teacher can be empowered by getting some idea of the knowledge of language research, or in a nutshell, the ideas of both competence and performance and Lung and Parole. So, coming to the conclusion part, we will be quickly talking about what all we have learned today. So, we talked about competence and we said that competence and Lung both are related to the knowledge of language, but there are conceptual differences. We can say that performance and Parole are both related to the usage of language, and these are individual. We can also say that we can include the concepts of social variation in the knowledge of language questions now, which is a fairly newer development, but it is important for us to note that social components are becoming important in the literature of competence. And we also talked about the fact that all these concepts can be helpful for us in the domain of language teaching. So, I hope you will remember all these points, and we will come back to this distinction again and again for future reference. These are the key references that I have used. Thank you.